The axis shifts. Why? South Asia will decide the next global order. The illusion of peripheral status. For decades, South Asia was treated as a peripheral zone, important but not decisive. That assumption is structurally flawed. The region is not marginal, it is compressed power. The global system historically centered around the Atlantic, then partially shifted towards East Asia, particularly China. Now the next shift is about replacing one pole with another. It is about a dense, unstable, high-stakes zone exerting disproportionate influence across multiple domains simultaneously. South Asia, anchored by India and surrounded by nuclear states, trade corridors, demographic pressure, represents exactly that kind of a zone. The mistake most analysts make is linear thinking. They evaluate regions based on current GDP or institutional stability. That approach misses second and third order effects. South Asia is not dominant today in absolute terms, but it is positioned at the intersection of growth, conflict, and systemic risk. That combination creates leverage. Regions that concentrate leverage, not stability, shapes global orders. Demographic mass as strategic capital. South Asia's most obvious asset is also its most understood, also its most misunderstood population. This is not merely about numbers, it is about scale interacting with time. The region contains a massive share of global youth population, particularly in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. In isolation, population can be a liability. Combined with even moderate economic growth, it becomes an engine of labor supply, consumption demand, and political mobilization. First order effects. Labor availability drives manufacturing and service expansion. Second order effects rise. Rising income creates internal markets large enough to sustain domestic growth cycles. Third order effects. Population becomes geopolitical weight. More soldiers, more migrants, more voters, influencing global narratives through diaspora networks. The structural implication is simple. Any global system that ignores a regional hold, such demographic density is mispriced. Over time, capital, attention, and conflict migrate towards population centers. South Asia is one of the largest. India, as a system level anchor. The central pillar of South Asia's rise is the trajectory of India. It, if India sustains even moderately high growth, its transition from a regional power to a system level actor. This is not speculative, it is structural. Large populations combined with steady productivity gains inevitably produce large-scale economies that reshape global production, finance, and politics. India's role is not just economic, it operates simultaneously across multiple domains as a democratic counterweight in a world increasingly influenced by authoritarian models, as a digital infrastructure pioneered through systems like unified payment networks, as a military power, also as a military power with expanding reach. Each domain feeds the other. Economic growth funds military capacity. Military stability enables economic expansion. Digital systems accelerate both. The critical point is not whether India becomes dominant, it is that its trajectory alone is sufficient to force global recalibration. Supply chains, alliances, strategic doctrines must adjust around it. That adjustment process is what reshapes global order. The nuclear constraint and strategic volatility. South Asia contains one of the most dangerous strategic configurations in the world. India, Pakistan, and China form a triangular deterrence system layered with territorial disputes, historical grievances, and asymmetric capabilities. First order effect persistent, low intensity conflicts, especially in the region like Kashmir. Second order effect rapid escalation risk due to miscalculation or domestic political pressure. Third order effects global shock potential. Any large scale conflict between nuclear armed states would trigger immediate international intervention, economic disruption, and possibly systematic crisis. This volatility creates relevance. Regions that can destabilize the global system command attention and influence. South Asia doesn't need to dominate economically to matter. Its capacity to generate high impact crises ensures it remains central to global strategic calculations. The Indian Ocean, artery of global trade. Geography amplifies everything. South Asia is positioned along the Indian Ocean, one of the most critical maritime zones on the planet. Energy flows from the Middle East, manufacturing exports from Asia, trading routes connecting trading routes connecting Europe and East Asia all pass through or near this region. Control or even partial influence over these routes translates into leverage over global commerce. Ports in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and India are not isolated assets, they are nodes in a network contested by major powers. The second order dynamic is naval expansion. As trade importance rises, so does military presence. The Indian Ocean is increasingly a theater for power projection, involving not only regional states but also external actors like the United States and China. This convergence transforms South Asia from a continental region into a maritime pivot. The China factor, competitive penetration. South Asia is one of the primary arenas where China projects influence beyond its immediate borders. Infrastructure investments, port development, finance linkages create a network of dependencies across the region. It isn't altruism, it is strategic positioning. First order effect increased connectivity and infrastructure development in smaller South Asian states. Second order effect debt dependence and political leverage for China. Third order effects counter moves by India and its partners, creating a competitive environment that intensifies geopolitical stakes. The outcome is not dominance by one side but persistent contestation. Contestation generates friction, and friction generates importance. The region becomes a battlefield not necessarily of direct war but of influence, capital, and alignment. Fragmentation, identity, and internal instability. South Asia is not a unified bloc. It is fragmented along religions, linguistic, and ethnic lines. Nationalism in India, political volatility in Pakistan, socio-economic pressures in Bangladesh creates a landscape where internal dynamics often spill into regional or global consequences. Instability is not an exception, it is a recurring feature. This matters because instability produces unpredictable outcomes. Migration surges, political radicalization, economic shocks emanating from the region can ripple outward. From a systems perspective, instability increases the probability of non-linear events. Non-linear events such as sudden crises, regime shifts, unexpected conflicts are what disrupt existing orders and accelerate transition to new worlds. Climate pressure and resource scarcity. South Asia is one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world. Rising temperatures, water scarcity, flooding, and agricultural stress are not distant risks. They are ongoing processes. First order effect reduced agricultural productivity, increased food insecurity. Second order effect internal displacement and urban pressure. Third order effect cross border migration and potential conflict over resources, particularly water. These pressures interact with existing political and economic systems. Weak infrastructure amplifies climate shock. High population density intensifies their impact. The result is a region where environmental stress becomes a driver of geopolitical changes. The convergence, why South Asia matters disproportionately. No single factor explains South Asia's importance. It is the convergence that matters. Population scale, economic growth potential, nuclear risk, maritime geography, great power competition, internal fragmentation, climate vulnerability all exist simultaneously in one region. This convergence creates a high-density zone for global influence. Decisions made in New Delhi, Islamabad, or Dhaka do not remain local. They cascade through trade systems, security frameworks, and political alliances. The global order is not determined by a single dominant factor. It is shaped by interactions between regions that concentrate power, risk, and opportunity. South Asia is one of those regions. Conclusion: from margin to core. The assumptions that global order will be decided solely by established power is outdated. Structural forces are redistributing influence towards regions that combine scale with volatility. South Asia fits that profile precisely. The trajectory is not guaranteed. Mismanagement could convert potential into crisis. But even failure has consequences at this scale, whether through growth, conflict, or disruption. South Asia with exert influence. Before decline, South Asia was not a passive geography. It was an active economic core. Under entities like the Mughal Empire, the region controlled a significant share of global manufacturing output, particularly in textiles, metallurgy, and agricultural surplus. The Indian Ocean trade network integrated South Asia with East Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, creating a decentralized but tightly functional economic system. The first order reality is that South Asia historically generated wealth internally and exported high value goods. The second order implication is more important. It possessed institutional and commercial complexity sufficient to sustain large scale economic activity without external control. This matters because it disapproves the modern assumptions that South Asia's rise is new. It is a reversion, not a creation. The collapse of this system was not due to inherent weakness alone, it was accelerated by external extraction mechanisms, colonial extraction, and structural deformation. The entry of the British East India Company and later the British Raj transformed South Asia from a production center into an extraction zone. This was not simply political domination, it was economic reconfiguration. First order effect: local industries were systematically weakened. Indian textiles, once globally dominant, were undermined by British industrial imports. Second order effect: South Asia was reoriented towards raw material export, cotton, indigo, opium, feeding industrial growth in Britain. Third order effect: capital accumulation shifted outward, draining local capacity for reinvestment. Infrastructure such as railway is often misinterpreted as development. In reality, it was optimized for extraction efficiency, moving resources from inland regions to ports for export. The system was not designed to integrate domestic markets but to connect supply zones to imperial demand centers. The structural consequences was long-term distortion. South Asia didn't merely lose wealth; it lost its internal economic architecture, partition, fragmentation as a permanent constraint. The end of colonial rule didn't produce a unified recovery; it produced fragmentation. The partition of 1947 created India and Pakistan under conditions of extreme violence, mass displacement, and institutional rupture. First order effects: immediate humanitarian crisis with millions displaced and hundreds of thousands killed. Second order effect: permanent geopolitical rivalry, particularly over Kashmir. Third order effect: duplication of state structures, military establishments, and economic systems that would never have been more efficient if ruined. Partition embedded conflict into the region's DNA. It transformed what could have been a consolidated power into competent states locked in zero-sum dynamics. This fragmentation is not incidental. It is one of the primary reasons South Asia is simultaneously powerful and unstable. Cold War positioning: peripheral but weaponized. During the Cold War, South Asia was not central to global strategy, but it was irrelevant. It was selectively weaponized. India adopted a non-aligned posture, attempting to balance between the United States and the Soviet Union, while Pakistan aligned more directly with the Western blocs themselves. First order effect: military and financial aid flowed into the region, but unevenly. Second order effect: internal political systems were influenced by external powers, often reinforcing authoritarian tendencies or centralized control. Third order effect: regional conflicts, particularly Indo-Pak wars, became indirectly linked to superpower competition. The key outcome was strategic dependency without structural transformation. South Asia remained peripheral in economic terms but gained relevance as geopolitical instrument. Post 1991 liberalization, re-entry into the global system. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent liberalization of India's economy in 1991 marked a structural turning point. South Asia began reintegrating into the global system not as a colony but as a participant. First order effect: increased foreign investment and trade integration, particularly in India's service sector and Bangladesh's manufacturing base. Second order effect: emergence of new economic hubs such as Bangalore's IT industry and Bangladesh's government sector. Third order effect: gradual shift from state controlled economies to market oriented systems, enabling sustained growth. The phase didn't eliminate structural weakness, but it reversed the direction of movement. South Asia transitioned from extraction to participation. The present transition from periphery to pressure point. Today, South Asia is no longer peripheral, it is a pressure point. The region sits at the intersection of multiple global forces: economic growth, geopolitical rivalry, demographic expansion, and environmental stress. The first order effect reality The first order reality is visible growth, particularly in India and Bangladesh. The second order effect is increasing geopolitical competition, especially involving China. The third order implication is systemic relevance. Decisions made within South Asia now have cascading effects beyond the region. The transformation is incomplete, but the trajectory is clear. South Asia has moved from being acting upon to acting within the global system. Structural conclusion of Part 1. The historical trajectory of South Asia is not linear decline or sudden rise. It is a cycle of centrality, displacement, fragmentation, and re-emergence. Pre-colonial strength established capacity, colonial rule dismantled internal systems, partition fragmented power, the Cold War instrumentalized the region without elevating it. Post-1991 reforms reintroduced it into global flows. The present moment is the convergence of these phases. Part 2. Demographic mass and human capital leverage. Population as a strategic instrument, not as statistics. Most analysts treat population as a background variable. That is a failure of interpretation. In South Asia, population is not passive, it is active strategic instrument. The region contains one of the highest concentrations of human beings on the planet, anchored by India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This is not just scale, it is density interacting with time, geography, and institutional capacity. First order effect, a vast labor pool capable of sustaining both low cost manufacturing and high skilled services simultaneously. Second order effect, a massive internal consumption base that reduces dependency on external demand cycles. Third order effect, political weight, where sheer numbers translate into influences across global migration networks, electoral systems in diaspora heavy countries, and international labor markets. Population becomes power only when it interacts with systems. South Asia is now at the stage where systems, whether they are economic, digital, or political, are beginning to absorb and deploy their mass. The demographic divide, conditional, not guaranteed. The concept of a demographic dividend is not misused. It is not automatic, it is conditional. South Asia has a disproportionately young population compared of the aging regions like Europe or East Asia. This creates a temporary window where the working age population is largely relative to dependence. If utilized, the first order effect is accelerated economic growth due to increased labor participation. The second order effect is rising savings and investment rates as working populations accumulate capital. The third order effect is a geopolitical leverage as countries with younger populations sustain military recruitment, innovation cycles, and long term economic expansion. If mismanaged, the same structure produces instability. Unemployed youth do not remain neutral, they convert into political volatility, social unrest, or migration pressure. The demographic dividend flips into a demographic burden. The region currently is going through a transitional phase where both outcomes are possible. This ambiguity is precisely what makes it globally significant. India's human capital gradient. India represents the most complex human capital structure in South Asia. It is not homogeneous, it is stratified. At the top end, India produces globally competitive engineers, entrepreneurs, and professionals feeding into technology sectors, financial services, and research ecosystems. At the lower end, it maintains a vast informal workforce engaging in agriculture, construction, and low productivity services. This dual structure creates both strength and inefficiency. First order effect, high skill sectors integrate into global markets, particularly in IT and services. Second order effects, low skill sectors provide cost advantages but limit productivity growth. Third order effects, internal inequality creates pressure on political systems influencing policy decisions that can either accelerate or constrain growth. The key point is that India's demographic power is not just size, it is distribution. A small percentage of highly skilled individuals can disproportionately influence global systems while the broader population sustains internal economic momentum. Pakistan's youth bulge and strategic risk. Pakistan presents a different demographic profile. It has a significant youth bulge but with weaker economic absorption capacity compared to India. This creates a structural imbalance. The first order effect, high population growth increases pressure on education, employment, and infrastructure system. Second order effect, insufficient job creation leads to underemployment or informal economic activity. Third order effect, heighten risk of political instability, radicalization, or outward migration. From a global perspective, this matters because instability in a nuclear armed state amplifies systematic risk. Pakistan's demographic structure doesn't just influence its internal trajectory, it affects regional security and global strategic calculus. Bangladesh density as an economic multiplier. Bangladesh operates under extreme population density. Unlike larger countries with spatial buffers, Bangladesh compresses millions into a relatively small geographic area. This constraint has produced a specific economic model. Labor intensive industries, particularly garments, scale rapidly due to abundant low cost labor. Second order effect, export oriented growth integrates Bangladesh into global supply chains. Third order effect, rising income and social indicators, particularly in health and education, gradually improve human capital quality. Density, often seen as a weakness, becomes an efficiency mechanism when aligned with the right industries. Bangladesh demonstrates that economic pressure can be converted into economic output under specific conditions, migration, and the externalization of population pressure. South Asia doesn't contain its population within its border, it exports it. Migration is a structural release valve. Workers from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh move to Middle East, Europe, North America, and Southeast Asia. First order effect. Remittance becomes a significant source of foreign exchange, stabilizing national economy. Second order effect. Diaspora communities create transnational networks influencing business, politics, and culture. Third order effects. Global labor markets become partially dependent on South Asian supply, increasing the region's indirect leverage. Migration transforms demographic pressure into global influence. It extends South Asia's reach beyond its geographic boundaries, embedding it with other economies. Urbanization, concentration of economic activity. Urbanization is the mechanism that converts population into productivity. South Asia is undergoing rapid urban expansion with cities like Mumbai, Karachi, and Dhaka absorbing millions. First order effect, concentration of labor and capital increases economic output. Second order effect, transition infrastructure strain creates inefficiencies, traffic, housing shortages, pollution. Third order effect, cities become political and economic centers shaping national trajectories. Urbanization is uneven, often chaotic, but it is necessary. Without it, population remains dispersed and underutilized. With it, population becomes economically active. Education and skill formation, the bottleneck variable. Population alone is insufficient. Skill determines value. South Asia faces a structural bottleneck in education quality and access. While elite institutions produce high level talents, large segments of the population lack adequate training. First order effect mismatch between labor supply and industry demand. Second order effect underemployment despite high population. Third order effect slower productivity growth compared to potential. This bottleneck is critical because it determines whether demographic mass translates into economic and geopolitical power or remains latent. South Asian demographic profile is not a simple advantage. It is a high risk, high reward system. The region possesses raw inputs for power, scale, youth, and global dispersion. Whether these inputs convert into sustainable influence depends on the system's efficiency, concentrating on education, employment, urbanization, and governance. When people talk about South Asia's economic rise, they usually reduce it to lazy shorthand. They say the region is growing fast, as if GDP alone explains strategic importance. That is superficial analysis. Growth matters only when one asks what is growing, how it is growing, and what captures the gains. The structural weaknesses remain underneath, and whether the model can survive shocks. South Asia's economic importance doesn't come from one clean regional story. It comes from uneven, asymmetric, and highly consequential national trajectories that together create a zone of expanding global relevance. The reason this matters for the next global order is simple. The international system is not shaped only by the richest economies. It is shaped by economies that are large enough to alter labor markets, trade flows, manufacturing chains, energy demands, technology adoption, migration patterns, and military spending. South Asia is increasingly doing all of that at once. The region's economies are still marked by poverty, infrastructure deficit, informal labor, and institutional distortion. But those weaknesses do not cancel its importance. In some cases, they intensify it by making the region both opportunity zone and risk zone at the same time. India's scale changes the equation. The single largest economic fact in South Asia is India's scale. That scale changes everything. A small country can grow quickly without reshaping the world. India cannot. Once an economy of that size accelerates, even imperfectly, the consequences spill outward. India affects commodity demand, capital allocation, manufacturing location decisions, technology markets, defense spending, energy imports, and diplomatic bargaining. It doesn't need to surpass every rival to matter. Its size alone ensures that global actors must account for it. India's economic trajectory since liberalization has been defined by partial reform rather than complete transformation. That has created a hybrid structure. On one side, there is world class performance in selected sectors such as information technology, pharmaceuticals, digital payments, business services, and parts of advanced manufacturing. On the other side, there remains a huge low productivity mass in agriculture, informal employment, weak logistics, underdeveloped urban planning, and uneven educational quality. This duality is not a side note, it is the core of the Indian growth model. The first order effect of this structure is that India can generate islands of excellence without lifting the entire system uniformly. The second order effect is that these islands attract global capital, talent, and attention, while the underlying social and infrastructure deficiencies remain unresolved. The third order effect is strategic ambiguity. India appears simultaneously both advanced and least developed than outsiders expect. That ambiguity confuses rivals and investors alike, but it also creates room for rapid nonlinear gains if bottlenecks are reduced, even moderately. Service technology and the Indian economic signature. India's most distinctive contribution to South Asia's economic profile is its strength in services and digital infrastructure. Most late rising economies historically built influence through manufacturing first. India has done something unusual. It built major global relevance through software, IT-enabled services, outsourcing, back-office operations, business process management, and increasing digital public infrastructure. That doesn't mean manufacturing is irrelevant. It means India's rise has already shown that South Asia's economic role in the world will not merely copy East Asia's earlier path. This matters because the global order is increasingly shaped by information flows, platform economics, data, and digital payments, as well as service integration rather than only by factory output. India's ability to operate at scale in these domains gives it disproportionate strategic leverage. A country that can build digital rails for hundreds of millions of people is not just managing internal development. It is providing state capacity in a domain many rich states handle less effectively. This strengthens India's economic credibility and gives it a model that can be exported diplomatically, commercially, and ideologically. Yet this advantage has limits. Services do not absorb labor at the same scale as broad manufacturing does. High skill digital growth creates prestige and foreign exchange, but it doesn't automatically solve mass employment. That gap is dangerous. If elite sectors race ahead while the employment base remains fragile, the system generates inequality, social frustration, and underused demographic capacity. The point is not that India's model is weak. The point is that its present strength do not remove its structural obligations. The, for India to become a true system defining economy, it must broaden its growth engine beyond enclaves of competence. Manufacturing and the question of strategic substitution. One of the most important economic question is coming decades the coming decades is whether South Asia, especially India and Bangladesh, can capture manufacturing capacity that firms and states increasingly want to diversify away from excessive dependence on China. This is where global order starts becoming concrete rather than abstract. Supply chains are power. The countries that host them gain employment, technology transfer, infrastructure investment, customs relevance, diplomatic weight, and long-term bargaining leverage. India has obvious advantages in this context: scale, domestic demand, political visibility, and growing strategic alignment with states that want alternative production bases. But it also has serious disadvantages. Land acquisition remains difficult, logistics are uneven, bureaucracy still imposes friction, labor formalization is incomplete, state level differences are substantial. This means that India's manufacturing rise is real but not automatic. It can attract selective sectors such as electronics assembly, defense production, automotive components, and chemicals, yet still fail to become the fully integrated manufacturing rival that many slogans promise. This matters because expectations can outrun capacity. If global capital expects India to replace China at scale, India delivers only partial substitution. The result will not be collapse but recalibration. More likely, the future is fragmented. India will capture some strategic sectors. Southeast Asia will capture others. China will remain deeply embedded. South Asia's role is in that outcome is still major. Even partial manufacturing relocation into India changes global production geography. Bangladesh and the discipline of narrow strength. If India represents scale and diversification potential, Bangladesh represents the power of concentrated economic specialization. Bangladesh didn't rise by trying to do everything. It rose by doing a few things relentlessly, especially labor intensive export manufacturing. Its garment sector became the central growth engine, integrating the country into global trade networks and creating one of the clearest examples in South Asia of how disciplined sectoral focus can transform national economic outcomes. The importance of Bangladesh goes beyond the garments industry itself. It demonstrates that South Asian economies do not need to wait for perfect institutions before achieving global relevance. They can enter the international system through concentrated competitive advantages. Bangladesh leveraged low-cost labor, female workforce participation, export orientation, and gradual improvements in social indicators to build a manufacturing model with real global significance. This made the country far more important than its size suggests. But concentrated strength comes from concentrated vulnerability as well. Deep dependence on one sector means external demand shocks, trade policy changes, reputational issues, labor standard pressure, climate disruption, or technological substitution can hit really hard. A system built on narrow specialization grows quickly until it encounters the ceiling imposed by overconcentration. Bangladesh's new challenge is therefore not providing, not proving it can grow. It has already done that. Its challenge is upgrading, moving from a low-cost assembly towards a more resilient industrial depth, better infrastructure, higher value exports, broader urban industrial capacity. Whether it succeeds matters to the region because Bangladesh is a test case for whether South Asian middle power can climb without becoming trapped. Bangladesh and the economics of strategic friction. Pakistan's economic relevance is often misunderstood. Analysts either dismiss it because of recurring instability or overstate its importance because of military and geopolitical role. The correct view is harsher. Pakistan matters economically not because it has built a strong growth model but because its instability interacts with strategic geography, security cooperation, foreign financing, and demographic pressure in ways that the world cannot ignore. It is an economy with persistent structural problems that remains too significant to disappear from the system. Pakistan has faced repeated cycles of fiscal stress, external account pressure, debt management difficulty, inflation, political turmoil, and weak export competitiveness. These are not isolated policy errors, they reflect deeper structural weaknesses, narrow tax capacity, chronic energy problems, insufficient industrial competitiveness, elite capture, and a political economy where short term survival often beats long term restructuring. This creates a pattern where crises recur faster than reforms consolidate. The first order effect is economic fragility. The second order effect is strategic dependence on foreign lenders, bilateral support, and geopolitical bargaining. The third order effect is that Pakistan's economy becomes inseparable from security concerns. A weak economy inside a nuclear armed state with major military relevance is not a regional side issue. It is a global risk variable. Pakistan's inability to stabilize and deepen growth doesn't reduce its importance. It changes the way that importance is experienced, less as opportunity, more as pressure. Sri Lanka, Nepal, and the smaller state lesson. The smaller South Asian states are not economically large enough to decide the global order on their own, but they are large enough to reveal how the region functions under pressure. Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and others illustrate the constraints facing smaller economic facing smaller economies located between larger power centers. Their economic choices are shaped by debt exposure, trade dependence, remittance reliance, tourism vulnerability, infrastructure financing, and geopolitical balancing. These are not trivial concerns. They are microcosms of how the next global order may work for many secondary states. Sri Lanka is especially instructive because it shows what happens when external borrowing, domestic fragility, and political mismanagement collide. Economic crisis in a strategically located island state immediately becomes more than a domestic issue. Ports, lenders, creditors, neighboring powers, and maritime security concerns all converge. In other words, economic weakness in South Asia doesn't stay economic for long, it becomes geopolitical. That pattern is one of the strongest reasons that this region matters globally. Nepal offers another variation. It survives not through major industrial power but through balancing remittances, proximity advantage, and the careful management of relations with larger neighbors. Such states remind us that South Asia's economic significance is not only a matter of internal output, it is a matter of positional value within broader systems of trade, transit, diplomacy, and competition. Informality, the hidden structure beneath the growth story. One of the most important facts about South Asia is one of the least glamorous. A huge share of economic life remains informal. This is not a peripheral issue, it is central. Informal work means low tax capture, limited legal protection, weak productivity measure, unstable household income, and reduced state capacity. It also means resilience, flexibility, and survival in systems where formal employment cannot absorb the labor force. This creates a contradiction. South Asia's economies grow partly because millions of people improvise, hustle, and work outside rigid formal systems. But the same informality limits productivity scaling, welfare provision, planning efficiency, and fiscal depth. The region therefore contains a persistent tension between entrepreneurial vitality and structural underdevelopment. The tension matters because the next global order will reward economies that can combine scale with formal coordination. South Asia has the scale, the coordination remains incomplete. If formalization proceeds intelligently, productivity gains could be substantial. If it proceeds poorly, by imposing costs without building opportunities, it could suppress the survival mechanisms that keep large populations economically active. The issue is not whether formalization is good, the issue is whether states in a region can execute it without crushing the very populations they claim to uplift. Energy demand and industrial ambition. Economic rise requires energy. This is where South Asia becomes globally consequential in material terms as industrialization, urbanization, transport demand, air conditioning usage, digital infrastructure, and household consumption all expand the region's appetite for energy rises sharply that alters international energy markets, shipping patterns, import dependence, climate politics, and infrastructure financing. India's energy demand alone is enough to influence global hydrocarbon markets, power, equipment supply chains, grid development, and the pace of renewable scaling. Pakistan and Bangladesh also face hard energy constraints that shape industrial potential and social stability. Energy shortages are not just technical problems, they are growth engines, fiscal burdens, and political triggers. They are constrain factories, strain public budgets, and generate public anger quickly. This is why South Asia's economic future is tied to a multi-layered energy transition. The energy becomes more the region needs more energy, cheaper energy, and more reliable sources of energy. This is a brutal requirement. Rich states historically industrialized through dirtier, simpler energy pathways and only later worried about decarbonization. South Asia is attempting to develop under strict climate change expectations and tighter financing policies. That makes its energy choice globally significant. The way South Asia solves or fails to solve the energy equation will shape not only its growth but also the credibility of development models across the global south. Infrastructure as the physical test of ambition. Every South Asian growth story eventually crashes into the same concrete reality infrastructure. Roads, ports, railways, power grids, logistic farms, industrial corridors, urban transit, water system, warehousing, digital connectivity, and border procedures determine whether economic potential becomes actual output or remains trapped in speeches. Infrastructure is where rhetoric gets humiliated. India has made visible progress in several infrastructure domains, but its size means the deficit is still immense. Bangladesh has improved significantly but remains vulnerable to congestion and climate exposure. Pakistan infrastructure investments have often been tied to geopolitical financing patterns rather than fully coherent domestic industrial restructuring. The smaller states face their own scale and financing limitations. Across the region, infrastructure quality remains one of the clearest dividing lines between promise and performance. This matters globally because supply chains do not relocate on sentiment. They relocate on cost, reliability, transit time, customer efficiency, power stability, contract enforceability, and industrial clustering. South Asia can extract admiration without attracting factories if infrastructure gaps persist. That is the hard truth. The region's strategic future depends not only on speeches about destiny, but on ports that move containers quickly, grids that do not fail, and cities that can function under expansion. The rise of domestic consumption. One of South Asia's biggest long-term strengths is the gradual rise of domestic consumption. Large populations with growing incomes create internal demand that can sustain production, attract investors, and cushion external shocks. This is especially important because export led growth alone is vulnerable to recession abroad, protectionism, and
Shifting trade preference, a region with its own consumption engine is harder to marginalize. India again leads here because of sheer scale. Even modest gains in income across a huge population produce major market expansion in housing, finance, transport, retail, digital services, education, healthcare, consumer goods. Bangladesh also shows this dynamic is more compressed form as manufacturing-led income gains feed domestic demand. Pakistan's internal market is substantial as well, but chronic instability weakens its conversion into stable long-term economic power. The second-order effect of consumption growth is corporate interest. Multinational firms do not look only at labor cost; they look at markets. South Asia matters because it is not merely a place to produce cheaply; it is also increasingly a place to sell. That dual role strengthens bargaining power and deepens the region's integration into global capitalism. Inequality, fragility, and the limits of celebration. It would be intellectually dishonest to describe South Asia's economic trajectories as a simple success story. The region remains marked by severe inequality, uneven state capacity, corruption, labor precarity, agrarian distress, urban slum expansion, and periodic crises. Growth figures can hide weaknesses, elite sectors can mask insecurity, financial optimism can run institutional debt. They are not side issues, they are failure points. The real question is whether South Asia has problems. Of course it does. The real question is not whether South Asia has problems. Of course it does. The real question is whether those problems prevent it from shaping the global order. They do not. In fact, they partly explain why the region will shape it. South Asia is importantly precise because it combines massive growth potential with major instability channels. It doesn't respond to a polished system, it is a consequential one. The world will increasingly be forced to respond to both its successes and its breakdowns. South Asia's economic importance lies in its asymmetry. India offers scale, technological ambition, systematic influence. Bangladesh offers disciplined manufacturing growth and proof that concentrated specialization can work. Pakistan offers a harsher lesson, an economically fragile state that can remain globally important when strategy, demography, and security intersect. The smaller states reveal how debt, geography, and external dependence shape secondary actors in a contested region. Together, these trajectories form a regional economic system that is not unified, not stable, and not even successful, but undeniably consequential. South Asia is becoming one of the arenas where the future of manufacturing diversification, energy demand, labor absorption, urban growth, and development under climate stress will be tested in real time. This is why its economic story matters far beyond the region itself.